Hey, listeners, welcome to another episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. Today, we're going to a state that we haven't visited in on the podcast before. We're going down to Virginia, and to show us around a little bit, we're going to Ironclad Distilling, and we've got distiller Owen King on with us. Owen, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So, I'm not exactly sure how I got introduced to Ironclad. I think Kara might have reached out, or I might have reached out to Kara. I'm not exactly sure, but I was really happy when we got connected because, again, I hadn't spoken to a distillery in Virginia. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Mount Vernon kind of gets the lion's share of the Virginia distilling press, if you will.
I would say between them and A. Smith Bowman, yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah, those do. So, I hadn't really heard about them before, about Ironclad, but as I love, you guys have a fantastic story. I got to try a bunch of the products, which I particularly loved. I particularly loved I got to say up front, the Old Kernel and the Flying Fox winery finish.
Oh, yeah.
But we'll get to those a little bit later. So why don't you just walk us through the basics? What was the distillery's origin story?
Yeah. So you can go back to 2014 is when we opened the distillery. So my dad, about 15 years ago, bought this 30,000 square foot warehouse located in downtown Newport News. And so he had another business operating out of there. And as busy as his other business ever was, he was never utilizing all 30,000 square feet of this warehouse. Mm-hmm. And so we were trying to think. So after I graduated college, I came down to work for him. And so we were kicking around the idea, at night when we were sitting around drinking bourbon, thinking, what can we do to really maximize the potential of this building? And the one thing we kept coming back to was, how hard could it be to open a bourbon distillery? Now, those are very famous, last words, but so one day I walked into work and he's like, hey, by the way, I bought a still. And I was like, okay, great. We're bootleggers now. And so the still arrived. It was just a little 26-gallon hillbilly still. As soon as it arrived, it also came with all this paperwork saying you cannot use this still. It is federally illegal. And you have to go through all the paperwork to become a actual distillery. So once we read that, we're like, okay, we don't really want to go to jail. So we decided, let's go ahead and get our distiller's permit and see how this thing goes. So we got our distillery permit. It took about a year. And because at that time there were much fewer distilleries and much fewer people working at the TTB to, push along distillery licenses. And so we got it, started distilling, liked what we were making, and but then realized that 26 gallons was making to fill a 53-gallon barrel was taking us 2 months. So we're like, all right, this is not going to work. So we went and bought 5 more stills just like it, which our kind of model distillery was Kings County up in Brooklyn. And so they started pretty much the exact same way we did. And so we went up there to just kind of talk to them and get their idea of how to expand, how to do everything, how to make sure these were, we could monetize these. They were open books. They liked what we were making. Colin Spolman was incredibly helpful. I used to email him constantly, just asking him what do I do here? I've got a problem here. And he'd help me put out the fire here and there. And so that was really helpful. And then we were just thinking that, if we're going to make this thing work, we really need to have a decent size still. So about 3 years ago, we bought a 500-gallon still, which, is still the incredibly small side of craft, but it allows us to kind of control our own destiny. So we're putting away a 53-gallon barrel a day, which is good for us. I mean, we're happy with that production where it's at right now.
So after as you put it, the hillbilly still, and what came after? What does the still setup look like now?
So what we did is we had 5 stills running in succession that were all pot stills. And then they'd all run into a column still, 4-plate column still. And so we really like the the distillate that was coming off of those. And so we wanted to mimic that same still. So we have a combination still. So it's a 500-gallon pot still with a column attached to it. So we get a double distillation similar to that of what we had with the hillbilly stills. I'm still really happy. And I like the stuff coming off this still. I like a whole lot more than the stuff that came off the old stills.
From Vendome, Forsyths?
No, so this one's from Affordable Distilling Equipment. They're based out of Missouri and assembled in America, but fabricated in China.
Gotcha. I think I know another distillery up here up here in New York that also uses from them. So that answers who is creating distilling equipment in Missouri. So thank you for that. Jumping back a little bit. So Kings County, oddly enough, it's one of the distilleries that kind of changed my journey in whiskey and in bourbon.
Yeah, definitely.
Timing wise, surprisingly enough, I had an episode that I taped with them back last year. Thought I lost it, found it. So that's actually it'll be a couple weeks back from when this episode airs, but it's going to be kind of an archival lost episode
nice.
Coming out in 3 days. So, but yeah, I love Colin, love what he's doing there. I don't always love some of the products, but that's just my own tastes. No one loves everything from every distillery.
Exactly. Yeah. I love Four Roses, but I don't love everything. I don't love the yellow label Four Roses.
Exactly. I will, however, later this month be camping out for Kings County's 7-year-old.
The Bottled and Bond.
That one if I can, but I'm really going after the oated whiskey.
Oh yeah, I just saw that one that the other day. That one sounds incredibly interesting. That one does sound really cool.
I had their last batch of oat whiskey, the one that they said they would never make again, and then which clearly not the case. And it's also the day after I come back from Kentucky, so it's going to be quite a turnaround. But I'm
from my experience, every time I get back from Kentucky, I do not want to see or hear bourbon for quite a while.
True, very true. So just to round out that topic, you said you love what they were doing. Colin, of course, as I hear from pretty much everyone who interacts with him, open book, happy to ask and answer questions. Was there anything else that you took from took directly from Kings County in terms of how you wanted to set things up, or your even barrel choices, or anything else that kind of inspired you?
So we read Colin's book to start the distillery. That was where we got kind of our base knowledge of how to distill. And he gives in the Guide to Urban Moonshining, he gives exactly detailed notes on how to do everything, how to set up the still, how to run it, how to mash, how to everything you might need. And so he was really helpful. We were using turbo yeast to begin with because we just wanted to make sure we were actually going to ferment. Mm-hmm. And he's, when he tasted our stuff, he said, "Oh, I can taste the turbo yeast in this." But he hooked us up with a really cool craft yeast purveyor, and so we started using them. And then I think other people knew about them, so their demand got skyrocketed, and we were so small that we were the first to get kicked out. We now use Wilderness Trail Firm Solutions yeast strains, which I love. Wilderness Trail, they do some really cool stuff over there.
Absolutely.
But it was just, anytime I ran into a problem with the hillbilly stills, he had already ran into that problem. So it was just a really useful resource to email him when I had a problem and be like, how did you fix this? And then he would be like, okay, well, this is what we did to fix that. And then just looking at his setup, and because he had, by the time we went to go visit him, he was already out of the hillbilly stills. And he had his I think there were 250 Vendome stills, the pot stills, and which is he's upgraded since then, since those. But it was just, we had the idea and the vision of like, okay, this is where we're potentially going, to kind of continue to follow in their footsteps because they've been super successful. And so it kind of gave us a proof of concept that this could grow the way we want it to grow.
It makes sense. Makes sense. And so the next thing before we jump kind of into the historical aspect of where you are, Ironclad is in Newport News, Virginia. So southern portion of Virginia. If I'm picturing it right, it's about as south as you can go, if I remember.
Very close. Yeah.
Very close. And you're in the city.
So we're in downtown. Anywhere else downtown, it sounds like it's a city. But Newport News is 7 miles wide, 13 miles long. We're in the industrial area, which was in the 60s, a very big hub for dignitaries and all this stuff, because that's where all the ships were being built for the Navy. And so now, if you fast forward through the 80s and 90s, kind of fell in hard times because the shipyard kind of took over the whole area. And so it was just a spot for work. And there was no like thriving businesses down there. So now we're kind of right across from City Hall, which is kind of good, kind of bad at the same point. Yeah, so it's a downtown area, but it's not necessarily a bustling, business center. It's just, you can drive down there and you can see, oh, look, there's 5 aircraft carriers down here right now, which is more the aircraft carriers than there are anywhere else in the world at this point, which is kind of always kind of a cool thing to see in the morning.
Absolutely. And I'd imagine being, that close to aircraft carriers and, of course, very heavy Navy presence, and also being across the street from City Hall, I'd imagine your codes are a little stricter than normal.
Well, Newport News had never had a distillery, and they have one right now. So when we were going through to get our permits from the city to distill, they threw the book at us, and they were like, we have to do everything by the code because that's what the code says. And we're like, well, you have to look at it one way, then yes, that's what the code says. So we'd follow that, but you have to also kind of think that our building is made of concrete and brick. It's not going to burn down. The contents in it might catch fire, but that's a different problem. But so there were little things here and there, and luckily, eventually they would see eye to eye with us because they kind of saw that the writing on the wall that this could potentially revitalize the downtown area of Newport News, of bringing tourism and people down here to an area that, and bring other businesses down to an area that, was kind of forgotten. So luckily now, since we've opened, we've got a brewery, 2 restaurants, a whole bunch of apartments just got built. So there is a sort of revitalization of downtown Newport News. And I'm not saying this because of us, but at least there was something that drove other people down here towards us.
That makes absolute sense. And last question before we go into the history too is, I am curious. I don't think I saw this on the website, but did your family have naval connections?
No, we have no naval connections. We just we were talking. The reason we're called Ironclad is because in 1862, March 9th, 1862, was the first ever battle between 2 ironclad ships, which is the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia. And so we were talking to the Mariners Museum, which is in Newport News. They actually have the turret of the USS Monitor in their museum. And we were talking to the lead historian there, and they said, from your building, you would have had a front row seat to watch that battle take place. And so when we were pitching ideas of what to name the distillery, we kind of came across that history, and we thought, that really ties in the area, and especially with the naval base we have so close, kind of ties them in as well. So we thought that would be the best name for the distillery. So that's why we went with Ironclad.
Gotcha. I asked that, of course, not to put you on the spot. It was more because one of our about to be recent guests was Old Line Spirits out of Maryland.
Yeah, and know them very well.
Yeah. So Mark and Arch are ex-Navy airmen, but they kind of downplay the military association. It's very subtle in their bottlings. They got Bravo Zulu on there, but otherwise it's kind of muted, I guess is the word I want to use.
Yeah.
But I do love in both cases the historical connections. So, we'll come back to the monitor, but I wanted to jump back a little further, and this was based on listening to a podcast you did. It was a local podcast in Virginia, I think last year, and it was really telling how the distilling history of Virginia as a whole, but also divided between when Kentucky was a part of Virginia versus afterwards. So I'd love you to just, run us through that if you could.
Yeah. So we always say that Virginia is the birthplace of American spirits because they landed in Jamestown like 1618. And they had the rations of beer they brought over with them from England. And they get here, they drink all that. And now they're desperate to, have more alcohol. So they brought over this guy from England. His name was George Thorpe, who was a preacher and then also knew the process of distillation. So they noticed there was just tons of corn around there. So they decided to make a corn beer. They drank it. It was awful. And then they're like, oh, well, the next step to this is let's distill it. So they distilled this corn beer, which is essentially what bourbon is. And so the first drop of bourbon was made in Berkeley Plantation in like 1620. There is a little bit this. So there is historical documents of this saying that it could be it, but also that he may have put it into a 5-gallon keg, but it doesn't necessarily say if it was his distillate or if it was his corn beer. But either way, so, the first drop of bourbon was made here in Virginia. My other part I like to say is, Elijah Craig, who's kind of like the godfather, the grandfather of bourbon, was born in Fairfax County, Virginia. And then the first distillation in Kentucky took place 1783, which at that point, Kentucky was still a part of Virginia because Kentucky didn't become a state until 1792. So again, birthplace of bourbon is Virginia.
Okay, it's not only accurate, it is very fair. And I'm thinking back, I did get the chance to visit A. Smith Bowman I guess about 2 months ago now, just briefly, but that wasn't really a part of the historical context that they put out. It was more about their distillery in particular, and the history forward, but not so much the fact that, as you said, before 1792, Kentucky is part of Virginia. So we
have to remember who their parent company is.
Of course. And we won't get into that, but of course, you're right. So agreed. The first, what we would consider bourbon as made in Virginia. What, if anything, kind of changed after Kentucky separated from Virginia in terms of distilling history?
My knowledge of distilling history. So I imagine after Kentucky became a state, there was still farmers distilling corn because that's what every farmer had to still, because they were using all the leftover grain that they'd have at the end of the harvest, and they would distill it up, and that would be their liquor for the year. I can't tell you exactly what all was continued to be distilled here in Virginia between 1792 and 1920. But it was probably a lot of Applejack, I would guess, because we have tons of orchards and all that stuff. There was probably still plenty of corn liquor being made. But the amount of distilleries in Virginia there weren't many that were operating in mass scale. I mean, A. Smith Bowman, I believe, was one of the bigger ones, that started, what was it, 1940 or something like that, right after Prohibition. And they were, I think, the only gig in town for a while. But I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, it's still impressive. So jumping forward now, what does the kind of the modern distilling landscape in Virginia look like?
Yeah. So we have at last count, it's going up every day. We have over 80 distilleries in the state,
Wow.
um, which is awesome. We were number 15 and number 20 um, when we signed up back in 2014. And so it's really cool. I mean, there's a lot of distilleries that are kind of doing their own thing. We have one distillery that makes a fantastic absinthe. We do have, a macro distillery they're still technically craft with A. Smith Bowman. So, we do still have that really big presence, but they're really cool. They're super helpful, really nice people. They usually try to have an event that brings all the craft distilleries to their distillery. So everyone can kind of have an event there with selling bottles and things like that, which is really nice to them because people love going to A. Smith Bowman. And then we've got, the bigger craft guys like Catoctin Creek and Copper Fox, and who else am I forgetting? So I mean, we've got some really bigger distilleries, or bigger craft distilleries, and then we've also got the small guys who get just to go out there and make Ostervite, which is aquavit made with oysters. So there's a whole bunch of really cool, very craft niche things. And then there's also the bigger, greater mass distillation, consistent flavor bottles.
An aquavit of oysters. I get it. I get it because of where it is, but I don't get it.
It's actually really good. I know it sounds weird. It was really good.
Look, that there was a where was it? I forget where it was, but it was recently there was a green crab whiskey.
Oh yeah, that was up in Maine or
Maine.
Massachusetts, one of the two.
Yeah,
I just saw that it was a
Maine.
whiskey. I don't know how they got that one passed, but that's yeah.
I don't know either. I support what they're trying to do with it. I don't really want to try it. I'm open to trying most things, good or bad, but I just nope. I'm good. That and the whiskey from the beaver glands also. I'm okay. I'll stick to my regularly scheduled programming on those. So in terms of Virginia, obviously it's quite a large state. It's going to be geologically and ecologically diverse, but for what Ironclad is trying to do and is producing, what does your environment look like and the climate that you have to deal with?
So the one thing since we started that I really cared about was I wanted to use only local grains. So we reached out to the Virginia Department of Agriculture when we first started, and I said, "This is what I'm looking for. I need a farmer who can provide me with these grains. Can you point me in that direction?" And they were very helpful, pointing me immediately to this one farmer. His name's Dave Hula. He's in Charles City, Virginia, and he wins. He's got world records for corn production, like corn yield off the kernel. And so he just does this every year in, year out, and knows corn better than anyone I know. And he has, thousands of acres. He also still farms the longest farmed land in America for Williamsburg, the colonial Williamsburg. And so I met with him and I said, "Listen, I want to make a 4-grain bourbon because I want to make sure I'm showcasing agriculture from Virginia to show how great Virginia agriculture is." And so he goes, "Well, I can do corn and I can do wheat for you. I have those, all the time." He goes, "The rye, I'm a seedsman, so rye. If I plant rye and my rye gets cross pollinated with my wheat, people will never buy wheat from me again." And I was like, "Okay, well, do you have a local farmer you can source rye from?" And he goes, "Oh yeah, definitely." And so he was like, "No problem." So he had all the grains I needed. He tried growing malting barley, but he didn't realize that when you grow malted barley or malting barley, you want to grow it very low in protein, which is the opposite of what he does with everything else.
Right.
And so he sends it off to sample to see if it can malt. And they go, "This is incredibly high in protein. We cannot malt this." And so he tried it, didn't work. He's like, oh, well, here we go. So we get our malt from a few different maltsters. We do try to get some local Virginia malt every once in a while, but most of our malt comes from Northwest.
And look, understandable. It's a familiar train I've heard from a bunch of distillers who are trying to do exactly what you're doing. The local grain is the local grain, and you take that as far as you can. But at a certain point, if it's not there, I mean, it's not there.
Yeah.
It's trying to grow rye in Kentucky. It just doesn't
work.
take well. Doesn't work there. So Virginia also, you're dealing with these, I would think, very humid, hot summers.
Yep.
Do you get the kind of temperature variations you would get in what we think of as bourbon region in Kentucky?
We're pretty similar. We don't get as cold. We'll get less snow than Kentucky gets, most of Kentucky gets. So our climate is very comparable. But yeah, it works out that we're still getting those great fluctuations. And it's not like we're Texas where they have a month straight of 100 degrees. We'll still fluctuate between, 100 and 82 and sometimes a little lower than that, then sometimes back up. And so we've got that same moniker that if you don't like the weather in Virginia, wait 5 minutes, and it will change. And then we're also in the hurricane path, which is always fun when hurricanes come through, because you can walk into the barrel room and you can literally hear the barrels cracking because the fluctuation and pressure that's coming through. And that's always one of my favorite things to listen to, is just hear the little crack, 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 crack.
That must be, I mean, all kidding aside, that must be somewhat terrifying when you hear that. Like, is it to a level where you expect them to crack and burst, or is it more like micro cracks?
It's like micro cracks. Like you can just hear like the expansion of the wood.
Gotcha. Do you at least get some good leaky barrels out of it?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Just as long as there's not puddles on the floor, we're okay. I don't, just a few drops. That's all right.
All right. That's good. I love those leaky barrels.
Yes.
And which actually we'll get back to you in a second, because I want to definitely bring that up later. But the last thing I wanted to do with the environment was your water source. I asked that because you talk about on the website that the air, at least, is very, it's important because of the brackish James River that you're on. So I'd love to talk about your water.
Yeah, so Newport News city water is our main water source, which actually the water itself is really good. It still has chloramines in it. It still has chlorine in it. So we have double carbon filters that take out all that stuff because those will hinder fermentation. But the proximity of our distillery, which is 200 yards from the James River, which is a brackish water river, and where we're at, it's the salty part of the river. It really adds, I think, a characteristic, and there's not, this terroir is more spoken about in wines and things like that, but I do think that there is a certain terroir, at least environment wise, for how barrels age. And so with that salty, brackish air that's constantly flowing over the barrels, I really think that kind of adds a certain characteristic to the whiskey. So I always like to kind of speak about that in my tours that I'm giving, is that there's not a ton of distilleries. There are 0 distilleries in Kentucky that are sitting on a brackish water river. So I just like to make sure that I just point at that little thing, and just as something that's a little different, because as much as everyone wants to be like a distillery in Kentucky, I also want to be an individual that isn't necessarily the same as anyone else.
Hey, totally fair. And just in your estimation, before I add in before I write up any tasting notes quite yet, I have them, but I always do 2 or 3 times, so I want to make sure I get it again. What is that impact of the brackish water? Like, does it impart any kind of salinity, or
that's where I kind of think it kind of comes in, at least in our small batch, it kind of comes in as a salted caramel. That's the kind of note I get with it. With our straight, it's just kind of like a little bit of a salinity flavor, because our straight tends to have more of a cinnamon forward note instead of that kind of sweeter caramel note that I get in our small batch, even though the same mash bill, and that could be those two flavors just because they're two different types of oak, or two different barrel sizes. But yeah, I always think that there's a little bit of salted caramel in the back end of their small batch, and a little bit of salinity in the straight.
Gotcha. I mean, that makes sense. And I'll be honest, it took me off guard. And this is why I wanted you to say it first, because I wasn't sure if that was what was happening. But I did notice it a bit when I tried the small batch for the first time, and it caught me off guard, to be honest. And I wasn't exactly sure what I was having. It's like that first time when you try something with a little bit of peat in it, and you're like, that's new. What is that? And to have that, as you pointed out, like no one in Kentucky is on a brackish water source. So no one in Kentucky is having any kind of salinity in their air or their humidity. So it was a little bit different. And it took me, on the first try, I wasn't sure about it. The second try, I kind of got that better, and I could nail down that note. And once it was explained, like, but by you just now also, and just kind of thinking about like, what would a brackish water source do? It makes a lot more sense in terms of the flavor profile. And it made it, that much more interesting, because I'm like, oh, that's what that flavor is coming from. So going back, it added, yes, salted caramel. And it's not like, licking a salt lick or something. It's just a hint.
Yeah.
Just a hint. But it was fascinating. And it's really a differentiator, which I like when, especially water sources, for some reason, water sources and grain sources. I love talking about differentiations there.
Yeah. No, so we've been messing around a lot with heritage corns. Today I just mashed it's called Hickory King corn. It's a white corn, but the kernels are like 2.5 times bigger than a normal like dent yellow field corn number 2. And so it's just, we've messed around with now 4 or 5 different kinds of corn. And it always amazes me of just that you change one little thing or one ingredient in your whole mash bill, and the whole thing is different. Which is why I love messing around with these different corns, because it's just these things that we're obligated by law to have 51% corn in our mash bill, and then you go ahead and make it with a different corn, and then all of a sudden you've got a completely different bourbon, even though you're using maybe essentially the same mash bill. So this is one of my favorite things to do, is just to continue to try these different corns, of which I've been able to find a lot of that are being grown around in Virginia.
Do you find that you have to change the mash bill significantly from one to the other, or are you able to kind of keep the same mash bill and end up with that different product?
So we're going to jump ahead, but since we're talking about the old Kernel, the old Kernel is a corn we got from the Eastern Shore of Virginia. And so this one, they can date back. The first time it was grown in Virginia was 1865. So it's, all corn is genetically modified. So it's tough to say that, this isn't genetically modified, but this isn't genetically modified in the sense that it hasn't been modified to be efficient. So this is a multicolored Indian corn that's red, purple, white, blue, yellow. It's got all the colors in it. And when I first got the corn, they gave us some of their cornmeal first. I made cornbread with it, and I didn't add any sugar to it because the corn is so naturally sweet. And so when I was doing this one, I was like, well, this is a really cool corn that's very naturally sweet. I don't necessarily want to do all these different grains in here, because I want the corn to be what you taste the most of. And so, but I knew I didn't want it to be one noted of only corn, because you need, like cooking, you want other things in there to kind of bring out those flavors. So I was like, let's just do a low rye here, 10% or 12%, just to kind of add background notes to make sure this balances everything out, to make sure that it is the best it can possibly be. And so when it came off the still, I was drinking it at 156, somewhere around there. And it was still incredibly naturally sweet. So I was like, okay, that's perfect. So the Hickory King that I was mashing today was 16% rye, because it was originally when the farmer gave it to us, he only had a certain amount of Hickory King corn. This was a couple years ago. He only had a certain amount of corn left, and then he also had a certain amount of Abruzzi rye left. He put them together in the same bag and said, I'll give this to you for, I was like 35 cents a pound. I just don't want to go. I don't want it to go to feed. And I was like, well, I don't want that either for this beautiful grains to go to feed. So I came up, got that all milled together. We mashed that. And it was very different because the corn had a such more earthier note to it. Instead of what I was used to with the super sweet notes that I got from the old Kernel corn. And then the other one I was doing was we got Bloody Butcher, and I had just gotten back from Bardstown Bourbon Company, and I had tried one of their white dogs, and it was, when I tried it, it was just like the best white dog I've ever had. And at Bardstown Bourbon Company, they're a complete open book, mostly because they're trying to be a production distillery. And so I was asking them about it, and I said, could I get this recipe? And they said, of course. So they gave me the recipe of their percentages of corn to wheat to malted barley. And I took a picture of that. And as soon as I got home, I had this Bloody Butcher corn. And I was like, I'm going to recreate that mash bill with the Bloody Butcher to kind of do my own twist on it. And so I think everything needs to have a different mash bill to it. But that being said, you could try something else with the yellow field corn and, try that with the same mash bill, and then just do a comparison. You can actually at least see how drastically different and how big of an impact the grains actually do make in the bourbon, which, usually you think the barrel is where the majority of the flavor is coming from, which is true, but those subtleties of flavor and the ones that you're really would make you really like bourbon is where that mash bill comes in.
I mean, I really love the old Kernel that I got to try. And it's funny because this conversation kind of dovetails with other recent ones that I've had, which are, one or two discussions about rye and rye varietals that are being revived. Of course, Rosen being the most famous, but there are others as well. And then with wheat, when I was talking to Ryan over at Middle West Spirits, talking about how wheat should really be explored more in terms of, it's not all soft red winter wheat.
Yeah.
There are other varieties out there. And there's been kind of exploration with the corn, Jeff the Creed putting out a Bloody Butcher. That was kind of the first one that people went to, it seems, because obviously it's, bloody red and catches the eye, and it's a really good name for marketing. Yeah, it's a cool name for marketing, let's be honest. But there are so many varieties that we don't think about because most our taste buds for bourbon are kind of attuned to that yellow number, dent number 2.
Yeah.
So, it sounds like, what you're doing is clearly purposeful. Like you're trying to get, when you use a different corn or a different grain, you're trying to get the mash bill that's going to feature that particular corn or grain the best way.
That's my idea behind it. Is I want everything to be unique, and I want the grains to really be able to shine, because these farmers that I'm working with they're not these macro farmers that are growing acres. They're kind of mom and pop farms that are maybe growing an acre of this or 5 acres of this, and some of it's going to distilleries, some of it's going to maybe a brewery. And there's not a ton of this grain so it's not, I don't want it to be wasted. I want it to go to, a good use of, and having them get the kind of credit, for growing these fantastic grains.
Not to, of course, throw anyone it wouldn't be anyone, but any varietal under the bus, but have there been corn varietals that you've tried that are just not good for producing whiskey?
So not yet. Everything I've done with the different corn, it hasn't come to age yet. Usually my analysis is if it tastes good coming off the still, the barrel's only going to help it. I'm not so Bloody Butcher isn't overly like incredible to me. It doesn't taste exactly like some heritage varietal of corn. It tastes more like dent to me. Mostly because I think it's become over farmed and not over farmed, but like it's become more genetically modified to become more yield friendly and more efficient. So I don't think it's bad. I just don't think it's been as cool as maybe my old Kernel bourbon corn that I get, or what this Hickory King has been. But it's just because I'm not saying it's bad, just saying it's different or more the same of dent.
Oh, sure. Of course, there's an element of wanting to. It's a nice name, and I'm sure it had something when the first kind of Bloody Butcher bourbons were coming out. But
Yep.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I kind of agree. I haven't noticed that much variation, certainly in later batches or more recent ones, I should say. There's not that much variation.
Yeah.
Or anything. So the marketing still works, but it's time to dig deeper. And it seems like, you're clearly doing that, which is fascinating. The Whiskey Ring podcast is proudly sponsored by Impex Beverages. Impex imports premium and rare whiskey, gin, rum, mezcals, liqueurs, and cordials from all over the world, from Scotland to Japan to Israel, Belgium, and Wales. Whether it's Kilchoman, Penderyn, Port Ascaig, Glenallachie, Ohishi, Fukano, M&H, Ardnamurchan, Black Tot, and more, there's guaranteed to be something in the Impex portfolio you'll love. Impex also oversees some of the most prestigious independent bottlers in the game, including Single Malts of Scotland, Single Cask Nation, Adelphi Selection, and its own Impex collection. Take a look at their site, impexbev.com, or reach out if you're curious about their offerings. I'm proud to have many of their bottles on my shelves and love sharing them with friends whenever I can. Thank you to Sam and to the team for joining the Whiskey Ring podcast as guest and sponsor. And now, a word from our newest sponsor. The most exclusive whiskey in the world can't be bought in a store. Born in Edinburgh, the Scotch Malt Whisky Society is the world's largest whiskey club, with over 30,000 members worldwide. They bottle each cask of whiskey as is. No diluting, no artificial coloring, or chill filtration. With new whiskeys released every week, the Scotch Malt Whisky Society offers the opportunity to taste spirits straight from the cask. I've been a member for over 2 years now, and I've loved the chance to explore my favorite distilleries with truly unique offerings, in particular from distilleries 4 and 53, and discovering new single malts not available anywhere else. Not a Scotch fan? No problem. The Scotch Malt Whisky Society releases 20-plus bottles each month to its members, including, yes, Scotch, but also including gin, bourbon, rum, and more. In fact, my favorite recent bottling was a corn whiskey from the largest family-owned distillery in the U.S., aged 11 years in New Oak and bottled at cask strength. This is a bottling that people have clamored for years, and it was only available to Scotch Malt Whisky Society members. If you're interested in joining, the Scotch Malt Whisky Society has graciously offered a discount to listeners of this podcast. Use code WRP, short for Whiskey Ring Podcast, at checkout for 20% off an annual membership at smwsa.com. That stands for Scotch Malt Whisky Society of America. I will also be putting the link and code in my bio and show notes for this and upcoming episodes. Thank you to the Scotch Malt Whisky Society for joining the Whiskey Ring Podcast as our newest sponsor, and please visit smwsa.com with code WRP for 20% off your annual membership. So when can we expect that Hickory King corn to come to market?
So the first barrels, everything that goes into a 53 for us, I like to try to make sure it gets to at least 4 years before we empty it. So that one is probably 2.5 years away. And then the ones one I just mashed today is at least 4. We've got the Pungo Indian Creek corn, which is what we use for the old Kernel. That one is available now. Since that one went to 30-gallon barrels instead of 53s. So that one can go about 3 years before it has to come out. We've got another batch of that coming out here sometime before Thanksgiving. And then the next one I've just started messing around with is we are making a rye, or have made a rye. And so we're using a Brutzy rye. And then I've got another varietal of rye that I'm getting sometime this year, as soon as it's done getting harvested and dried. I can't remember off the top of my head what it's called, but it's not rosin, but it starts with an R, and it's not just rye.
Right. And it's not Danko either. Right?
Hold on, I can actually look it up. My farmer just texted to me. It is called Ryman. Rymin. Ryman rye. He said, according to him, it's a good variety for whiskey. I had not heard of it.
I haven't either. I will have to look into that. So, I mean, that's kind of a surprise for me, because I don't know if this was said outright, but on the website, you guys are pretty committed to, you want to make bourbon.
Yeah. So that was, our idea was we only want to make bourbon. And then I got the itch to make a rye. So when the rye comes out, which will be next year, it's going to be called Betrayal. But it's a
Fair.
4-grain rye. It matches our 4-grain bourbon recipe, just inverses the grain mash bill. So it's 70% rye, 10% corn, 10% wheat, 10% malted barley. And so far, of initial tastings, I'm very happy with it.
Awesome. It's surprising, but of course I can't wait to try it, because I love trying. I've been on a rye kick for the last month or two. So
yeah. Got to get those nice minty green tea ryes in the summer. Oh, they're the best.
Those are pretty good. Yeah. Nice and refreshing.
Yeah.
So pardon me. So where to go next? So just, let's make sure to jump into the products themselves. We did talk about the old Kernel, but let's start with the small batch.
Yeah.
And the small batch, and I guess let's just go with the small batch.
Yeah. So when we started, like I said earlier, I wanted to make sure I was showcasing Virginia agriculture. So I wanted to do a 4-grain bourbon. At the time when we were opening up, there were 4-grain bourbons that existed, and there were 4-grain bourbons that were aging. But we kind of wanted to separate ourselves from the rest of the pack. So I wanted to do a 4-grain bourbon. The mash bill we initially started out with was 70% corn, 10% wheat, 10% rye, 10% malted barley. We started mashing that. I liked it. We haven't changed it since. So for the longest time, for about 3 years, we were only operating off of that one mash bill. And then it's mostly because we were incredibly small and we didn't really have time to switch out mash bills to fill other barrels that we would just sit back and wait for a while. So we started with just doing 15-gallon barrels. We still do 15-gallon barrels, but we're kind of doing less and less 15-gallon barrels every year and laying down more and more 53s. But we would always focus on at least laying down a 53-gallon barrel every year. And sometimes 2, to make sure that, because my one goal is I always wanted to get to a bottled and bond bourbon, because I just love the story of bottled and bond. I think it's really cool. It was nice that the federal government, their first Food and Drug Act ever, was to make sure they said whatever was in a whiskey bottle we certify as said as being in that whiskey bottle. So I knew 15's 4 years and a 15 might not necessarily taste the best at 4 years. So finally 4 years in, we are actually more, it was like 6 years in, we finally had a bottle of mud. But yeah, so our 4-grain mash bill, it's kind of been the base recipe we use for everything. So like any other craft distillery, we have a bunch of different finishes. So after a couple of years of running with just our small batch and 15-gallon barrels, and then we started filling 30-gallon barrels. Those were going to be up for our straight bourbon. So our straight bourbon, we like to make sure it gets about 2.5 years in the 30s. Now everything for our straight bourbon is 3 years plus. And then for our finishes, because we use very small producers, so like we have a maple syrup producer, we have a guy who makes a habanero infused honey. We have we give our barrels to local apiaries in Hampton Roads, which is the area where the distillery is. That we give the local honey or like local beekeepers, so they can age their honey in them, and then they give them back to us, so we can do like a very hyper local honey finished bourbon. Then we also give our barrels to a coffee roaster. And so the nice thing about the 15-gallon barrels is these producers who are smaller can fill those easily, instead of having to fill a 53, which is to fill one, it would be almost 6 15-gallon barrels. Or sorry, 4 15-gallon barrels. So that's what allows us to do some cooler stuff in the finishes and allows other people to kind of enhance their products by aging or getting that bourbon flavor out of our barrels. So, as much as I'd like to just go all 53s, it's not necessarily in the cards quite yet, because I still really like our finishes, and it'd be really hard to tell our, coffee roaster or our honey guy to say, all right, we only have 53s now. You've got to buy a lot more beans, and you have to find a lot more bees to fill these up. So that's kind of the basis of our 4-grain mash bill, and then we started branching off from there.
Gotcha. I mean, again, putting it that way, it makes much more sense, I guess. And I hadn't really thought about it, but that does make it easier for partners where you trade. I mean, a brewery, for example, can pretty easily fill a 53 because there's throwing the beer in there. But
yeah,
if you're dealing with someone like beans or honey or something that's not as easily produced by volume, small barrel makes sense. And I got to admit, like I said, I've gotten to try the AR hot honey, and the Flying Fox finish, and I love both of them, but especially the Flying Fox.
Yeah, so the Flying Fox one's done a bit differently, where in Virginia, in the middle kind of western part of the state, we do have a really nice area that makes, in my opinion, produces some fantastic wine. I mean, it's not necessarily just my opinion. There's a lot of people out there who think Virginia makes really good wine. But so I've gotten a really great relationship with this winemaker and winery. They're called Veritas. They have a sister winery called Flying Fox. And so when they empty barrels in the winter, they call me up, and I will go the day they empty the barrel. I'll pick it up, I'll drive it back, and I will refill it that day to make sure I'm maximizing the potential of that barrel. So we've done Petit Verdot for the first 3 barrels. And Petit Verdot is very big, very robust, nice and jammy, got those nice black pepper notes. So it pairs really well with the bourbon. This will be this year or next year will be the first time we've done a Cab Sav barrel, Cab Franc barrel, which again is also a very big red. And I'm really excited to see how that one turns out and see how different it is than the Petit Verdot. But yeah, I've been really lucky to become friends with them because they also make a vermouth. And so they currently are aging their vermouth in our used bourbon barrels as well. And so I'm very excited to one day finally get those barrels back. They've been sitting up there for about 3 years now. And every time I go up there and taste it, it just keeps getting better and better. So, it's going to be really cool when we finally get those barrels back to refill them and, have some really cool vermouth finished bourbon. It's going to be like a, Manhattan in a bottle.
That's awesome. Yeah. when I because I loved the Flying Fox, I had the Petit Verdots. Unfortunately, it's sold out like everywhere. Can't find it anywhere. But
Yeah, so we had a barrel of it because we usually do 1 to 2 barrels of it a year, and so we had a barrel. We just bottled it, and we do some distribution in Connecticut, and there's a liquor store up there called BevMax, and I just got back from some work withs up there, and I got back, and one of my reps called me and said, "Hey, how much of the Flying Fox do you have?" And I said, "Well, how much do you need?" He's like, "Well, I need 24 cases." And I was like, "Oh God, I don't know if I have that, but I'll check." I checked and I had 22 cases, and he's like, "Yeah, I'll take them all." And I was like, "What?" He goes, "I'll take them all." I was like, and he goes, "I need them by Monday." And he called me on Wednesday. And so I was like, "Well, can you meet me in Delaware?" And he's like, "Yeah, we can do that." And so we did the transfer and so it was like, "Okay, great. We've sold an entire barrel," but it's like, "Okay, great. I won't have another one until December."
Right. I mean, I don't blame him. I mean, it was just so good. But one of the things I wanted to do, and I reached out to Flying Fox to see if this was possible, was to get a bottle of their Petit Verdot. Because I wanted to see, it's so rare that you get to taste the product, that the actual product or specific product that the whiskey was finished in.
Yeah.
It's usually like it'll say it's a wine finish or a sherry finish, but you don't get to taste that sherry or that thing separately. So I really wanted to taste it. And they're of course out of it too, because it's very, very popular. And it's also off season, I think, when I reached out. But yeah, you can be sure when the next batch comes out, I'll drive up to Connecticut. I don't mind. It was delicious.
Thank you.
So the other one that I wanted to get to too was to go back to the Monitor, because you've got a blend based or named after the USS Monitor.
Yeah. So when we started the distillery, we were approached by a bunch of historians because everyone likes the story of the ironclad ships. And so this one guy had just written a book about the battle. And then he also talked about it in the book, the Monitor and the CSS Virginia in pop culture. And in like the 1890s in New York, which is where the Monitor was built, there was a whiskey brand. It was a rye whiskey that was made in the 1890s. It was called the Monitor Blend. And so he actually had found the advertisement for the Monitor Blend whiskey, or rye whiskey, and he had published it in the book. And we're like, "Oh my gosh, we have to figure out a way to make that label, to use that and make it into a label for our bourbon." And so we have a high wheated mash bill, and I was like, well, although this isn't necessarily a blend, it would be really cool to kind of make this label into our own and kind of just pay homage to this previous whiskey brand. And so my sister and our graphic designer went through and really worked at it, and I think came out with a really cool label that we use the same font that they used. We use the same advertisement they used, but we changed rye to bourbon. And on the advertisement, it actually depicted the battle as well. And so, how better way to use that than to put it on the label. So if you actually turn the bottle around, it's got the whole battle on the inside of the label. So if you look through the bourbon, you see the battle taking place in the bourbon as well. So it was just, very cool things you find out when you're distilling and when you're get to approached by historians of things you wouldn't know. And it's just, I think the most fascinating thing was we had no idea that brand existed, and that the fact that we're not the first people to think about naming a whiskey brand after the Ironclads was just super cool to us. That there's no such thing as original thought. But we were, it was just super cool that it happened like that.
Yeah, it's one of those. It's weird. It's one of those battles that's like, it's I feel like it was almost considered more important at the moment that it happened rather than historically, as opposed to other battles that are, look back on as like, wow, that was a really huge turning point or something, but it didn't necessarily seem so at
Yeah.
the time.
Well,
Um,
I mean, it did change naval warfare forever because
exactly. Yeah.
you could never build another ship out of wood because you were outclassed.
Mhm.
I mean, although the battle ended in a stalemate because these two ships they didn't have weaponry that could penetrate each other's hulls. So, um, yeah, it was. I mean, it was important, but it was a stalemate, which is kind of funny.
Absolutely. I mean, it in a similar kind of twist. I live up in McQueens in New York, and I live by a fort that was built around. I think it was built around the time of the Civil War, and but it was also at the time when munitions upgraded. Let's say, particularly missile munitions,
Uh-huh.
and they built about 90% of the fort based on what was existing, and then with the last 10% remaining, that new, what do you call it? The new, I don't know, thing. The word for the thing that flies through the air. Um, the new ballistic comes out.
Munitions.
Yeah. So the new ballistic comes out, and turns out the walls that they built are of no use against it. Just crumbles into pieces. So it becomes a training fort almost immediately. It's never used in combat. It's also, I mean, it's on the mouth of the Long Island Sound. It's not seeing combat anyway.
Yeah.
But um, it was just a funny coincidence there. But maybe I'm also pushing the connection too hard. But it's also, I think, a funny coincidence that you took so much from learning from Colin at Kings County, which is of course in the naval yards in New York, and is likely, I'd have to check this, but it's likely where or close to near where the monitor was built.
So the monitor was built in Greenpoint.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's a whole. So John Erickson was the guy who designed the USS Monitor, and so there's a whole. I don't think there's a museum, but there's a plaque in Greenpoint of where the shipyard was, where they built it. And so the reason for that is my brother lives in Greenpoint, Brooklyn.
Mhm.
So he also designed our logo, yeah, we'll call it a logo, which is our anchor with the column still on it. So he was in Greenpoint. We were in Newport News, so which was another reason we called it Ironclad, because we had that historical factor, and then it was also we're a family business, so it's me, my dad, my sister, and then my brother helps out from time to time with logos and branding and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Again, I love the history. I love the connections there. I know we are actually at the top of the hour. I don't want to keep you too long, but I'd have one last question, which I ask of certain states only, which was, you talked earlier about how the city of Newport News had to change their regulations. Like you were going to change the regulations because you were the first distillery to really be downtown, and that all needed to change. Uh, on the larger scale, with Virginia being a liquor control state, did you run into any issues creating distillery because of that? And have you had any issues since then?
So control state has its pluses and minuses. The plus is we have a distributor that for the entire state that costs us nothing to find, and they do all the legwork. I mean, obviously we do have to do our own advertising. We have to do our own marketing, things like that. But we were lucky in the fact that we were one of the earlier distilleries. And so when we went out to taste Virginia on our product, on our whiskey, we got 40 stores right at the start. So that was huge for us because at the time we did not have a tasting room where people could just come in and buy our bourbon. So fast forward a couple years, we were growing steadily in the ABC stores because people were requesting our bottles, and then it would get shipped to that store, which was they ship an entire case, and then they proclaimed September as Virginia Spirits Month, and so when they did that, they gave the top 10 selling distilleries in the state that they would put them into all, at the time, 365 stores in the state. So within 4 years, it must have been 3 years of starting to sell in ABC, we were in every single ABC store in the state, which was fantastic for us. I mean, as a small business, you can't ask for anything better than that. and we were only distributing in Virginia at the time. So all of our income was dependent on the state of Virginia. So that is incredibly helpful and was the reason we survived to this day. And then, but with that being said, it's Virginia ABC does take a percentage of it, but their percentage isn't any bigger than what any other distributor takes outside of Virginia. Virginia, we sometimes make a little bit more. Sometimes it breaks about even with any distributor we use. So, there's pluses and minuses to it. There's certain events that would be easier without Virginia ABC, or there'd be running the tasting room, which only allow. I would say the only negative would be running our tasting room. We're only allowed to serve 3 ounces per person per day. So if you want to come to the distillery, we can serve you 3 cocktails or a tasting flight. And then it's like, all right, well, thank you for coming. You can hang out here, but you can't drink anymore. It's not the worst thing. We don't necessarily want to be a bar. So we've been able to kind of pivot our own business model to maximize the potential of our tasting room, which I think we do a pretty good job of. So that being said, yes, it has its pluses and minuses. I think we're okay. We're pretty happy with Virginia ABC, and we don't necessarily, although the the model of ABC is kind of antiquated, it's working okay. I think it works okay.
That again, it's fair. I know for some states and for some distilleries, it's been kind of a hindrance to be in that kind of a state. But it sounds for you like it worked out about as well as it could. So that's
for us, we're in the southeastern corner of Virginia. To get to Bristol, Virginia, is like a 6-hour drive. We're in the ABC store in Bristol, Virginia. Now, if it wasn't a control state, would we be in that ABC store? Probably not. Or would we be in a liquor store in Bristol? Probably not.
Right. So, it'd be more trouble than it was worth to get there.
Exactly. You couldn't justify driving 6 hours to deliver a case of bourbon. But
right.
No, it's just in New York. The nice thing is we can kind of pick and choose, and we can be in the city, and that can be enough for us to just be for New York, and we don't have to worry about the rest of the state. And then if we have a demand for Saratoga, we could send a rep out there and push a couple liquor stores there. But it's just, I guess it's since it's all we've known, or since what we knew from the beginning, we were used to it, but not necessarily. Had it been a different scenario, maybe we would have never entered Virginia.
That's fair as well. And with New York, you can do the city or everything else. Is kind of 2 markets.
Yeah,
it's 2 markets. I did see you have some distribution here in Brooklyn.
Correct. Yeah.
So I'm gonna see what they have there. Of course, I checked first for the Flying Fox. They're out, but I will check for some of the other stuff too. Perfect. So Owen, thank you so much for taking the time to come on, talk about Ironclad. I'm really excited about this distillery, about your distillery, about what you're doing with different varietals of corn and experimentation with finishings and mash bills. It's fun. It seems like you're having fun doing it, which is the best thing to hear from a distillery. You want them to be having fun because it comes through in the whiskey.
Well, that's the nice thing about it being family run, and that I don't have to answer to anyone in the distillery. Whenever I want to do something, I just do it, and then I just tell them that that's what I'm doing. And so, as far as different finishes go, I currently I'm doing a barbecue sauce finish bourbon, which could definitely be a failure. But we'll see. So keep your eyes peeled for a barbecue sauce finish bourbon. Maybe it's the next hot thing.
I'll be honest. There's a burnt ends whiskey over in I think it's in either England or Scotland. It's a blend that's kind of barbecue, and I really want to try it because God, I love burnt ends. So I'm open. I'll try it.
There you go. All right, cool. I'll get you a sample as soon as it gets emptied.
Awesome. So in the meantime, hold on with me for a second after we finish the recording.
Yeah, of course.
But in the meantime, where can people find you and Ironclad?
So you can find us at ironcladdistillery.com. We can ship to 41 different states. There's a shipping tab on there. Follow us on all social medias. We've got Ironclad Distillery on Instagram and Facebook. I think that covers everything. Come down and see us at the distillery in Newport News. We've got a really great tasting room.
Awesome. I hope to do so. As soon as I can. I'm hoping. Got a lot of whiskey trips coming up, but I will try. And there'll be in the show notes for this episode links to the website, to the shipping site, to all social media, and to tasting notes of the products I got to try. Again, Owen, thank you so much. And it's been another episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast.
Thanks, David.